welcome to another episode of the Silmarillion sessions. I'm Dr. Mikhail Thompson, and this is my co-host, Mr. William Lassiter. And today we are discussing we're jumping into the actual coming of the elves into Middle-earth, the chapter where we finally introduce the elves. And there are two main themes that we want to talk about in this chapter, one of which we'll tackle in this episode, and the other theme we'll tackle in the next episode. And those two themes are, this episode, we're looking at epic style, because we're introducing the elves, and it's good to recall at this point that the entire work is framed as, right, essentially we're meant to understand the work, or the work's own self-understanding is that of being an elvish epic, right? So this is a cultural narrative, a formative story, an origin story above all, as well as a cosmology of the elves for the elves, their understanding of the universe. And we're going to dive into what that means and what that looks like. And the other theme, which we'll address in the next episode, is the question of what exactly are elves vis-a-vis dwarves? Are they either of them related to gnomes, pumpkins, or gremlins? And what about goblins and men and hobbits? And what is with all these different races in Middle-earth? How have people interpreted that? And how have people, to use the term that Umberto Eco likes to say, over-interpreted that maybe, or gone astray? It can happen from time to time, even to the best of us in reading literature. We might put our own stuff into there, but we'll unpack that in the next episode and see what's actually going on. How can we understand the relationship between some of these different kinds of people and people-like things within Middle-earth? But today we want to kick it off and kick it off with the understanding of the whole, and what kind of literature are we looking at here? What kind of book is this? And essentially it's an epic narrative. It's not in poetry, it's in prose. But actually, here's an interesting anecdote. Something that I came across recently was, if I understood correctly, that I believe there's speculation that the idea that the that the Silmarillion as we have it, the bits and pieces of it, obviously there's the published Silmarillion, there's the different manuscript traditions of it, plays a role of essentially being a prose-based text, out of which the idea was, perhaps the inspiration was in Tolkien's mind, though he obviously never completed the whole work. He never really even completed the Silmarillion for that matter. But one of the early ideas was that it's the prose basis out of which these other, I don't know what the right terminology is, but these other poetical epics and lays and all of these were drawn out of, would be written out. And so what we have, these stories in prose form, would be much more poetic epics, poetic lays, other kinds of literature with that. Lastly, that's more your domain in being able to give the proper nomenclature to some of those different kinds of things. But we have things like the Lay of Leithian about Beren and Luthien, and other things, of Earendil and all of that. There are a few bits and pieces, but I think the idea is that this is how we should understand this versus other kinds of epic literature, is that hypothetically in Middle-earth, those other things did exist, we don't have them, they never were passed down. However, we might understand it. Something like we might see the poetic Edda versus the prose Edda, or you've got something like Beowulf or other works that are written in verse versus what we tend to think of as history, which is much more prosaic, writing down, this is what happened, and then this person did this to somebody else, and it's not particularly crafted in a poetic way. But I think it's just some interesting framing that we could see vis-a-vis what it could otherwise be, and then we have some examples of that, like I said, the Lay of Leithian, and because this is something that's alluded to throughout, say, the Lord of the Rings. There's these other tales that are sung, which may be in Rivendell with Elrond. You'll hear them told or sung in full as they ought to be. So there's these references in Lord of the Rings to those kind of works, even though in, let's say, our primary world, they're only fragmentary, if they exist at all, in terms of what Tolkien actually got around to writing down. But I think a good place to start is within this chapter. There's a setup, and we'll kick it off with to talk about the language. What does it mean to be an epic, an epic work? And there's a particular part where the Varda have been striving again with Morgoth, because the coming of the elves is near. Everybody can sense it. And there's one paragraph in particular I just want to read out, to you, and then hand it over to you, Will, and say, what do you have to say about that in terms of the language, in terms of understanding how we approach this text as an epic?
Yep.
And that is, the paragraph is this. It is told that even as Varda ended her labors, and they were long, when first Menel Makar strode up the sky and the blue fire of Helluin flickered in the mist above the borders of the world, in that hour the children of earth awoke, the firstborn of Iluvatar. By the starlit mere of Cuivienen, water of awakening, they rose from the sleep of Iluvatar, and while they dwelt yet silent by Cuivienen, their eyes beheld first of all things the stars of heaven. Therefore they have ever loved the starlight, and have revered Varda Elentari above all the Valar. That's not how we normally talk, is it?
No, no, it isn't.
That is not. Maybe you do. I did, the streets like Don Quixote or something. But what's with that language? Why is it framed in that? Why are things phrased that way? What does that do to our sense when we're reading it?
Yeah, there's a lot there. First off, I think that Tolkien was he was thinking on different levels about this work. So on the one hand, it is an artifact within the world that he's creating, as well as being the thing that creates the world, which is kind of odd for us as readers. It's as though we are entering into Middle-earth and reading the text that is in Middle-earth to which people have reference. So that's kind of strange. It would be as though somebody who reads the Bible finds in the Bible a reference to the Bible. It was a very kind of odd thing. But I think what he's not making, it is an epic work in our not modern sense of the word epic, like tremendous, like huge. But it's not epic in the sense of the really classical epic, which is poetic and, dactylic hexameter and dealing with some single huge event, which is what epic really means poetically. But it does have elements of that monumental, formative thing that epic does, which I really like to say more like mythology itself does, because mythology, I think itself works as a formative thing. It forms the imagination, but it also forms the whole culture as well. A culture, when we look around us, has a single unit, a single work that it refers to over and over and over and over again. So the Greeks had Homer, for instance. The Romans, Virgil tried to do this with Aeneid, to make the Aeneid the formative work of the culture. For our Western culture, we have the Old and New Testament taken together as the book, the Biblos. And in a way, I think what Tolkien was doing was he was creating that formative work that forms Middle-earth, and thus forms in our imagination what Middle-earth actually is. The language stylistically, you're absolutely right, is not, if you compare this to the style of the Lord of the Rings or the Hobbit, you see a really remarkable difference between the three. The Hobbit is very prosaic. It's kind of childlike. It reads almost like a fairy tale, which is what exactly it is. It's the story told to his kids, later wrote down. But then the Lord of the Rings reads very much almost matter of fact. There are points in there where he writes as though something's happening, right? And then Gandalf rose up and he was taller than he had ever seemed before, that kind of thing. Or what is that great line, right? I am a keeper of the sacred fire, you shall not pass. He has phrases in there that are crafted in such a way that they seem much more monumental than normal speech. But the majority of the work is very prose-like. It just happens as common speech, so to speak. And I think that's probably because, on the one hand, it's written allegedly by Bilbo and then Frodo, but also, and then later Sam, but also it's that he's writing it, gearing it towards an adult human world. The Hobbit is geared towards a childlike human world. And this one you could say is geared, as you said, towards an adult elvish world almost.
It's an interesting thing, because within the world of Middle-earth, this is the Silmarillion is ostensibly an elvish work about elves, originating from elves. We're meant to understand. In fact, I think originally we're meant to understand as being written by a particular elf, or elf friend, elf wine or something. You know, sort of the original conceptions, that was the bridge between this work and our world, you know, over the tens of thousands of years that have transpired between them. Because remembering for everybody that the idea, the basic setup is that Middle Earth is our world just a long time ago. But The Hobbit, like you said, is understood within the world to be written by Bilbo. It's his holiday journal, you know, there and back again. These are the things that happen, and he's told in this kind of colloquial style, as you might imagine him telling the neighbors and the children around, the little, you know, tooks and boffins and whatnot that are, you know, his nieces and nephews. But The Lord of the Rings, it's interesting that I had never thought about this, but it is, right? It's written by Bilbo, but also really Frodo and Sam, but they're writing it in a world where the king has come back. They're writing it in a world that's formed by essentially a regime is the wrong word, but in a society that's now governed, informed by this Numenorian half elvish, half man.
Yeah.
You know, these descendants of both men and elves, and that shapes the work in that way as well. It seems to be a blend of both elements. You've got this high elvish prose, and then this very basic country, simple folk Hobbit story, and then The Lord of the Rings seems to bring those two together, meeting in some sort of middle ground.
Yeah, they do. One of the things that this is not, I don't want to go too far afield on this one. Hobbits in Jackson's version and other versions are normally depicted as short humans that are kind of rustic, and that's probably a pretty accurate depiction. But one thing that they miss is that hobbits also have in them a very strong element of the elvish. They are crafty in their own way. They live with nature in their own way. They are fond of song in the same way elves are. They are not concerned with this dour sort of thing that infects men's imaginations. They're not
grave and serious like men are.
No. So really, if you wanted to push it, you could say that hobbits, to a certain degree, they tend to be elvish, and they also tend to be human. So hobbits, I would suspect, you could say, are kind of a mix between men and elves, even more so than we see with the men of Numenor. You know,
because the men of Numenor are I mean, forgive the phrase, but something of a hybrid, or literally a blend between men and elves as the descendants. But hobbits occupy actually a liminal space in their essence, without being a blend or a mix. They just are something more on that space between. We're told in the Hobbit. I think you're onto something there, because in the Hobbit, when he's explaining what is a hobbit, I suppose that needs explaining nowadays, and he describes them much in a similar way that we might think of talking about gnomes. I mean, frankly, that's what it sounds like. You know, they're small, you know, prone to be fat and wear bright colors, you know, that kind of thing, earth tone, bright colors situation. And they have, he says, they have no magic except the ordinary sort. The ordinary sort of magic. So there is a kind of magical element even to hobbits in their ability to pass by quietly, to disappear when big stupid folk like you and me come rumbling through. They're set up in contrast to human beings. They're in that world, at least in the Hobbit, in the description in the book The Hobbit. They're described as being more in the category of things like pixies and gnomes and elves and fairies, that kind of thing.
Yes, and I've often noodled the idea of why didn't he write his books about humans, about men? Why didn't he write books as, say, Lloyd Alexander does in the Prydain series about a young man? He doesn't do that. He creates this whole new thing, this Hobbit, which is, it really is a blend of the elvish, which is the world of enchantment and of fantasy, and of men, which is the world of reality and matter-of-factness. They are both and neither at the same time. So really, Lord of the Rings, if you look at The Hobbit as a work that's about, it's really about children, if you will, but young children. And then you look at the Silmarillion as a world of elves. The Lord of the Rings is sort of a blend of the two in a way. I think it's both the adult human as well as the elvish element as well. I think it's interesting to note too that this work that we're looking at right now definitely influences the elves, but by extension, I think it also influences the world of human beings, you know, because the humans come into the world of elves and they deal with the world of elves, and all these events that occur that form what humans later have to deal with. But two last thoughts on this. I just thought of this. I've always wondered, why do the hobbits go west? You know, they're allegedly from that area somewhere around the eastern side of the Misty Mountains. You know, right around the river area, the Anduin. But they go west. The only characters that seem to quote unquote go west are elves.
Right. That's a good point.
So, you know, there's a sort of we're going west, but then this is a nice valley. We'll stop here. You know,
right. Because you're right. That echoes too in the Silmarillion, as we'll see later on in future chapters, later chapters. There's an echo in the hobbits crossing the Misty Mountains over and then going so far and then settling there.
Yep.
That seems to echo what we see the elves doing. You know, when they wake up, there's different groups of elves that kind of make it so far. Some don't cross the mountains, some do cross the mountains, and they don't go all the way. But there's that same directionality. There's an echo of that same kind of migration towards, and again, remembering that far in the west is the home of the gods, but that's Valinor. So heading towards Elven home, heading towards Valinor. I think you're right. The hobbits have an internal impulse that does move in that direction.
Yeah. And the whole thing raises the question of, as we'll get into later, what are these races, right, that we're dealing with? It does raises the question of if we're writing a story about elephants or we're writing a story about rabbits, as Richard Adams does in Watership Down, why care? You know, why should I'm not a rabbit. I'm not an elephant. What do I care? I'm not an elf. What do I care? If these works are about anything, they're about us. They're written by, and they are published and sold to humans. And, you know, the sales of Watership Down are very low in the lay pine community. So when we look at this, we have to ask the question, is there an element in the human person that is elvish-like? Is there an element in the human person that is hobbit-like or rabbit or elephant-like? You know, ancient cultures were very keen on the idea that human beings and rabbits are not far distant from one another, or bears or wolves or whatever.
Just look at the marginalia in medieval manuscripts.
Right. Dominate.
Yeah.
But in this case, we say, if we are reading this story of these elves and their origins and then their struggles and their failings, are we reading something about ourselves? Are we reading something about our own culture, history, life, existence on the earth? I think it's a fairly valid question, and maybe one we should shelve for later, but a very important one when we're looking at the style and what he's about.
Because I think what I would say, in essence what you just described is what I would say. Well, that's why myth looks the way that it does, right? That's what makes myth. Maybe it's, you know, that you take certain universal elements, universal truths, or even universal sort of arcs of narrative arcs of some sort, and you incarnate them within a work in a way that's symbolic, right? That you making a symbol. So is there something not projected into the myth, but is there something that's demonstrated in the myth, in this case the Silmarillion as myth, about elves as well as men, but also the Valar we've dealt with so far, just with the Valar and the relationship between the Valar. And we've talked in previous episodes about what they kind of represent within the human psyche and man's place in the world, all of that. But by symbolizing some of these truths or these universal elements as rabbits or as elephants or hobbits or other sorts of creatures that we say, well, that's other, that allows us to see the thing in perhaps a clearer way, in a more unprejudiced way. We just see the thing in itself because it's not bound up with an obvious reflection of me, in which case I get, when I look at myself in the mirror, I get caught up with the fact that it's a mirror image. It's the opposite, right? There's my left is on my right is on the left. Or if you listen to your voice recording of yourself, it doesn't sound right, and we get caught up in the middle ground. Whereas if the thing is projected onto, or it's symbolized, but it's transformed through symbol, there's perhaps even a stronger connection to me, or it cuts more to the heart, because I'm not caught up on these superficial things. I can see the thing more purely in itself. I wonder if that's an element to that
I think it is,
as well.
Yes, I think it is definitely an element to it, because we're looking out from the inside of this little tank here, And it's very difficult unless we have an outside object. It's very difficult for us to realize that the things that affect those things out there also affect us. I will die. I will get old. I will fall in love. I will be sad. I will be happy. All those things. When you have something outside of you, you can say, alas, poor Yorick, I knew him Horatio, a fellow of infinite jest, because you contemplated something else that has died, and therefore you can contemplate your own death, but by proxy. It's kind of like it's in a way, it's like the shield of Perseus, the shiny shield that he uses to slay the Medusa. It gives you an image that you can reflect upon without having to look directly at the fact that, you're going to die. Or you're happy, you're going to have heartache, you're going to have joy. Now, I think along those lines, I think Tolkien was very aware of the idea that if you're going to embody an idea in a work for people to reflect on, you have to have an arc that is meet for the law that you want to put into it. The Ark of the Covenant had to be of a certain style in order that the law was put into it. The person of Mary had to be of a certain type of woman so that the new law could be in her. And I don't think Tolkien was thinking this was the new law or anything, but I think he was very aware of the idea that when you go to embody something, you put, like, okay, if you want to make a really serious story, one of great tragedy and profound influence, you don't start it off by once there was a man from Nantucket, right? Putting it into a limerick is not the structure that is going to give you the power and the sorrow and the tragedy that you want to convey, right?
So that's interesting about this. So there's power in the very material or the casing through which you tell a story, and that's, for all intents and purposes, that's your phrasing, that's your syntax, that's the tone that you write in or tell, if it's oral tradition.
It reminds
the way that you phrase your things.
Yeah, it reminds me a great deal of the way the Catholic Church used to embody artifacts, various relics. You have a tooth of Saint Athanasius or whatever it is, and you put the tooth into this gold casing, and you don't actually see the tooth. You just look at the gold casing and venerate Saint Athanasius's tooth in the casing. It's almost like that. It's like you have to make something that is meet for whatever the subject is. I'm looking right now at Tolkien's letter 131, and this is a pretty pertinent phrase to this conversation. He says here, he's talking about the gods, and he says, on the side of mere narrative device, this is of course meant to provide beings of the same order of beauty, power, and majesty as the gods of higher mythology, which can yet be accepted. Well, shall we say baldly, by a mind that believes in the blessed Trinity. So he's kind of indicating here that human beings are already predisposed to accept things based to some degree on the, as you said, the casing, the mode that the thing is delivered in. And so you have to craft that thing so that it is delivering the right thing to the right people in the right way. And I think that's kind of what he's about here. One more thing, if I can add to the soup here, I was reading this really good review or analysis, if you will, of the Gospel of Saint Mark, and this is by Marianne Tolbert. And the work is called "Sowing the Gospel." We can put a link into the thing. And she says this really interesting thing about this. She says, constructing symbolic groups to act out each of the types permits the author to probe the human faults that may lie behind each unfruitful response, talking about the disciples. Such a process is indeed the whole point of typological or figurative narrative. An audience sees a universal principle with a human mask, but in so doing is encouraged to perceive that same principle in the real faces around it. As the characters interact and the plot moves towards its inevitable climax, the audience can begin to understand the fatal flaws that propel the scribes and the Pharisees, the disciples, Herod, and the rich man to their various unproductive ends. Such an effect on the audience might well be described as a popularized, diminished form of catharsis, the clarification of the pitiable and fearful experiences of failure to bear fruit. But the typology is a universal pattern of response. And I think that's the key thing that I took away from this little passage here. a universal pattern of response. I think that what Tolkien is doing in this whole thing on elves is he's showing us some sort of universal pattern of response, some sort of universal problem, if you will. But it's elvish, and it's supposed to be tragic, and so he's embodying it in a language which sounds like the King James Bible because of that. I can't imagine this limerick form, really. I can't imagine.
No, because within at least within any given language, you've got certain, let's say, rhetorical structures or stylistic structures, patterns of speaking, of writing, communicating, that convey the soul or the spirit of the thing that you're trying to get across. And so if you're writing something and all of a sudden, like a very gutsy Brooklyn dialect, you're trying to communicate a certain mode, a spirit, not just the content of the words or content of the message, but the message itself is the medium itself is the message, right? It's part of the message, the way that you're communicating that. And so then to speak in an elevated, some people would say kind of florally,
Yes.
kind of language is not just, in this case, when it's done well, it's done right, though it may be lampooned from time to time, is not just sort of narrative self-indulgence or authorial self-indulgence. It's meant to convey a certain spirit, a certain, we use high elevated of speech, certain word choice, word ordering, at least in English, for example. This gives a certain feel to it. This frames it up or puts what you're saying in a certain casing, in a certain context. Right. That in an elevated way, you're conveying something of a nobility, of a higher universality of truths, something, a more noble spirit or more universal truth, something that you're trying to convey at that level. That's not just the author saying, "Wow, look at me! I can use big words." He's actually trying to communicate something at a certain level, and which the correlate to that, though, and because this is something that I face, I know you face, I'm sure, with our students at all levels for as long as we've both been teaching. To the degree that students are unable to access, in other words, unable to actually understand in many cases the grammar and syntax of these of certain levels of speech or certain rhetorical forms or speech styles, to the degree they're unable to actually understand that, those kinds of communications are inaccessible to them.
Yes.
And it's not the fault. And one solution people have proposed, right, is, well, there's something wrong with the text, and that needs to be dumbed down. It needs to be broken down and made accessible. But it seems that in doing that, you lose something of the message itself, because you've broken the medium into a different medium. You're now changing the message by changing the medium.
Yeah, you have to shred the bird in order to understand it. It's maybe not.
Right.
Maybe shred the bird, so to speak.
Yeah. Right.
I love if just focusing on this text, given what you just said, to parse out the text. I think it's wonderful how he actually does craft the world of the elves before the elves even wake up. Recalling, of course, that the whole work, as Tolkien has enunciated in his own letters, is about fall mortality and machine magic. The response of machine magic to fallen mortality is juxtaposed to fantastical enchanting. And this just with the very, we call it the creation of the elves, but it's really the waking up of the elves, is much more of the fantastical enchanting than the machine magic form. Like, for instance, if you look at the very start of this paragraph here, it is told. Now that right away, that's a passive voice sentence, which means it is a less aggressive sentence. The dynamic aggressive sentence is an active voice sentence. Passive voice sentence is almost taking a back seat. It's almost like it's taking an intuitive, or you could say a feminine approach to things rather than a masculine approach to things. So right away, we've got the world of the feminine, which is the world of darkness and the moon and the elves, and the whole world is set up just in those first three words. It is told that the elves that occupy this world of the woods and the stars and the night are not, they can't afford to be feminine in their response to this horrendous world that Melkor has created, has corrupted. They have to be masculine, they have to be aggressive, but they don't want to be. And that ends up causing problems later on. But notice it is told, this means we've got a handed down tradition orally before it's ever written. Who is telling?
Who's doing the yeah, it's exactly right. And so it conveys even so much more that like this is something that has been passed on. It's not just because to render this differently, because I think this can be helpful to hear it told another way, is instead of it is told that even as Arda ended her labors, is I'm telling you, Varda was ending her labors. Okay, they were long, took a long time, and then this other guy came up, and so on and so forth. But I'm telling you, Varda ended her labors. I'm telling you, when Varda ended her labors, this other thing happened. That conveys a very different thing, or even just plain into the fact.
Yeah,
Varda was ending her labors.
Yes, right.
And then such and such happened.
It's a different phrase.
Yeah, it's a different phrase. It's a different message being communicated. It's a different message being communicated. It's one that's detached from any sense of, or at least detached from really strongly implicating anything that's come before, the sense of something being handed down.
Right.
Whereas it is told, 3 words, there's a history here now.
Yeah, so let me take 2 examples along those lines just to compare. One is from Genesis and one is from our documents of founding of America, because we're close to July 4th here, so that works. The document of Genesis, it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It can also be translated, in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth.
Yeah.
And my Jewish scholar friends tell me it can also be translated as beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, or in beginning, or when he began. There are all sorts of translations of that. What is it? Parhisees, bara, Elohim.
Yeah.
Lots of different translations. But the point being is that it's like the starting point. In the beginning, there it is. And then all this other stuff occurs. There's no passive. It's not passive at all. It's like, now we're going,
Right.
And so it's this really dynamic kind of, we're moving along sort of thing. It's different. Again, you could say, when the world was begun, or that kind of, that's kind of a more passive way of writing. Now, compared to the other document, which I'm thinking of, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to cast off when in the course of human events is automatically like placing this document right smack dab in the middle of everything. Blam, there it is.
It's like these guys were trained in classical rhetoric or something.
I know. Sure. But it's a very different thing than it is told, right? It's almost like we're moving, we're going, we're oh, this work doesn't seem to do that. It almost has this, I don't know quite what the word is exactly, but I would say contemplative way of looking at things rather than intellectual looking at things. It has a much more fantastical, enchanting way of looking at things than a machine magic way of looking at things. And what are they looking at? Not only is it after Varda has ended her labors, and I like the choice of words, right? Labor is also connected to childbirth. The labors are ended. Everything's calm. Everything's settled. There's like a pool of clear, still water, right? And suddenly you're looking up. If you are the audience in this text, you're looking up and you see Menel Makar striding up the sky.
That's the sun, by the way.
That's what I was going to say. It is a celestial body, particularly it's the sun, Menel Makar, striding up the sky, right? When first Menel Makar strode up the sky. So you get an image of this conscious being, right, making his way across the sky. And the blue fire of Helluin flickered in the mists above the borders of the world. That's a great image too. Who is Helluin? Helluin. What is that?
Yeah, which is exactly right. Is he gives the names without telling us what it is, just in this paragraph, because that's the experience. You're laying on the ground, on the borders of the edge of the wood, right beside the water, right in between 2 worlds, and you're looking up, and you see this thing. What is that? I'm going to name it I don't know what it is in terms of it's a big ball of gas made of burning millions of miles away. It's just Menel Makar, and she's beautiful.
Yes.
And then there's the blue fire of Halloween as he comes in, because for the elves, sun is feminine, moon is masculine.
Well, in the days
the Latinate languages.
In the days before internet, we would just have to like guess at what he was talking about. But now we do anything. Halloween is Sirius. It's the dog star, or a equivalent thereof. It's the name the elves give to the constellation Orion.
Ah, that's Halloween. So the Menel Makar is not the sun. What is Menel Makar?
I'll have to look that up too, actually.
That's right. I'm mistaken. But see, so here we are in the process of wandering, because it occurred to me when we said that, and wait a minute, that's not quite right, because the sun and the moon, they were awake before the sun and the moon and all that, because they lived under the stars for the first period of time.
So both are constellations.
Yeah.
Elmakar is the swordsman of the sky.
And that's Orion, isn't it?
No, it might be more akin to our Heracles, the constellation Heracles, perhaps.
Oh, I suppose.
We could just say that it's one of the constellations that is in Middle Earth, So again, he's creating his own world, so he can create his own constellations and groupings of stars if he wants, I guess. But you got the swordsman of the sky, and then you've got this other constellation. The constellation that is correspondent to Orion is Telumetar. And I'm not an authority. I'm just reading the bloody, website.
I'm just reading the website.
Reading the
whatever the Oracle told me, man. That's just what I'm going with.
It could be complete poppycock for all I know.
It could be. It all is at bottom. It's turtles all the way down.
I'm trusting you with my rep here, okay, Tolkien Gateway. So if anybody in the audience, viewing audience, wants to check this, go to tolkiengateway.net and type in Halloween. Okay, there you go.
That's right.
Anyway, the point being, you've got these constellations that are coming up on the horizon, rising up, almost like entities themselves, and you've got this image of mist everywhere, and the image of those constellations and the blue fire of the star, it's this very pastoral image. It's not violent, it's not aggressive, it's just, wow, that's gorgeous. And if you've ever gotten outside of the big cities and you see the stars as they really are, like out there in Arizona or Wyoming or up north here, it is a stunning experience. And you almost think, wow, anything could happen at this moment, right? And what does happen, right? The children of the earth awoke. Now, that's important because they aren't created. And they aren't like made out of clay and then have breath breathed into them, hurrah, right? They just awake. It's almost like there's seeds in the ground or something, right? We know that they're part of the song originally, but it's almost like they weren't there, and then they're there.
And that's an interesting way to look at it, because I thought of it in terms of their origin is shrouded in mist.
Yes.
Even they themselves, that's not been revealed to the elves, because this is an elfish work. It's not been revealed to them how they were created. It's not revealed to them how men were created. Men just showed up one day coming across the mountains, as we'll see, which sets it differently from the kind of text with Genesis, where it is revealed to man in the books of Moses how man came into being. That sets man in a different status vis-a-vis Iluvatar, God, Yahweh, than the elves vis-a-vis Iluvatar. They've got a different relationship. Each with
Yes, it does. But I mean, even in Genesis, it's interesting because you have two different creation stories. First off,
that's right.
The first creation story, God just speaks, and it is
right.
Okay. The second,
there's man and woman. There they are.
Yeah, exactly. The second story, he's got the mist on the ground, all over the ground, and then that makes clay, and then God takes the clay and he fashions it, and he breathes into it his ruah, and that's man, and then later woman is a rib taken out of a rational creature, right, while he sleeps. But in one story, you've got just this word being incarnated in a way. And then the second one, you've got a much older story that harkens back to the stories of Prometheus and Epimetheus from the Greeks, where they take soil and they make it into the thing.
An actual plasmification of,
Yeah. But in both stories, I mean, we could read them in any number of ways, and so this is just one way to read them, and one way to read the Silmarillion. One way to read it is, it doesn't actually matter how they were formed historically. What matters is how they're formed in each individual who's reading the story. So in other words, if you're reading a story and you are wondering, where did humans come from? Who are we? What is our purpose in life? What am I supposed to do with my life? Well, if you are the incarnation of a word of God that is in the likeness and image of God, that is a huge difference than if you are the blood of a rebel goddess that has been shredded and spread all over. It is a huge difference than if you are inert matter that is somehow operated by divine fire. So it makes a difference. So we view ourselves in many ways by how we came into being. That's much more significant. And one could look at Genesis and be, this is actually the story of my own life when I first became aware that I am not the center of the universe. Now, everybody in your life, hopefully, unless you're a complete narcissist, everybody has one point in life where you suddenly awaken, so to speak, to the fact that there are other things in the world, other beings in the world, that you are not the God, you are not the center of the universe. And that moment is when you genesis, you come into being.
Right.
And from there, then the rest of your life unfolds. And you could say this happens early in people, that they first recognize something, and then it happens again and again throughout our lives. The teenage awakening, and the 20-year-old awakening, and the 33-year-old awakening.
Right.
I remember the first time when I was a kid, I recognized that a bee. I had a bee in my hand, and I said, "So beautiful! It's so beautiful!" And I put my hand around it, and the thing stung me. And I was like, "Yeah!" I started crying. But it was a moment of just, on the one hand, it was a moment that there's this other creature. It's beautiful, and it can also cause me pain. Right?
Yeah.
That was an awakening. So
yeah.
The question here is not so much what is the exact way in which the elves come into existence.
They're not concerned about their biological, or the way we would think of what was the immediate material thing preceding that they came out of. That's even the point of the story.
Even their modern post-Enlightenment historical origins are not what's at stake. What's at stake is our, as a people, and our current existence as a people. What are we?
Yeah.
We are creatures of song, and creatures of mist, and creatures of starlight.
We're those who awakened under the stars.
Yes, exactly. Near the
That's
mirror
our story.
The mirror of Cuivienen, which is, I love that, the starlit mirror of Cuivienen. So we awaken by water under the stars from song. That's a great image for, Spartans thought that they were the children of Heracles, right?
Right.
And they're think that they were the descendants of a bloody revolution, or they're the descendants of fire and ice. It makes a huge difference as what you are in the current, according to what you came from, what you emerged from, what your lineage is. So, and sleep, because they're dreamlike creatures too. So the fact they awaken and rather are not birthed, because folks hate to say it, if you've ever been privy to an actual birth, it's a very different thing than awakening. There's a lot more that goes on. Yeah. But as a child, even, if you put yourself in the position of a child being birthed into the world, you are asleep, so to speak, in the womb, and you awaken to the world. And we even have that term, that old Anglo-Saxon term, the quickening, when a child, right,
being made animate.
Yeah, right. So it's a great beginning.
I think it is, and that's an interesting element to that too. The people surrounded by the stars. Well, who are we? Well, people are surrounded by the stars. So what? How did God make you? Where was your origin? Who was the first one that was born? How does that work? That's not part of the story. You're trying to impose your story frame. What say the modern, our contemporaries today. The sense of what's important to the modern Western person. So the sort of modern, postmodern, empirical West is going to be concerned about what do they say happened before them? Who were the first two? Because you had to have two in order to beget. So you're trying to impose your story framework of your world story, your Weltanschauung, onto this other people's who just don't have that same story. They don't have the same way of self-understanding, they don't have the same self-concept, they don't have the same cosmology, same cosmogony. It's a different story frame, which is you then how your identity carries yourself. And I think it's very interesting too in the way that peoples name themselves as well. That's something that's mentioned in a few paragraphs further on. And I think this comes back to that question of language and elevated language. Is they, like many peoples of the earth in different times and places, it says here about the elves, so long they call themselves those who speak. So long they dwelt in their first home by the water under stars, and they walked the earth in wonder, and they began to make speech and give names to all things that they perceived. Themselves they named the Quendi, signifying those that speak with voices, for as yet they had met no other living things that spoke or sang. So their understanding of themselves, our story, who are we? We're the people who awoke by the waters of Cuiviénen, by the starlit waters of Cuiviénen, looking up at the sky, up into the heavens among the stars. And we call ourselves the speech, the speaker, the speeched ones, essentially is what this word means, right? Those who speak with voices, because that's what distinguishes me from the other things that I see. We speak with voices.
That's an interesting phrase, because of course the humans speak with voices, as do hobbits and others, but they're still a Quendi.
Exactly.
The American Indians, the Native Americans, would call themselves the people.
Right. The human beings, the people.
We're the human. They aren't.
Exactly.
I love it too, how, just to go ahead, to project ahead a little bit, I love it how Tolkien then later the elves create these creatures that are in some ways like living Rolodexes, living encyclopedias. And they also herd trees, right? But they're living Rolodexes. They take the language of the Quendi and they remember all this stuff that has happened and all these names. And it's like, you could go to, we're talking about the Ents, of course, so you can go to one of these and ask it, okay, what is the creature that lives over here in such and such a land? And
let's see. Badgers, the whole builders. And exactly. And not only that, they're very approachable. It's like they took language and they took it like a little too seriously. You know, they don't move from word to word. They just add things. It's like that German tendency cranked up to the max. You know, who's going to put more words into the word to make a big word? Because that's how they understand names, right? In Entish, everything takes a long time to say because, well, any given name of a thing gets longer and more storied the longer the thing's around.
Yes. Linguistic quality there, because there are cultures that actually do that. They add elements to a word according to the history of the thing that they're discussing. Like the longest word in human language, I think, is the name of a volcano in Finland, and I'm pretty sure it's in Finland. And the name basically records almost every time the volcano has erupted, which I find absolutely fascinating. It gets longer and longer.
Cool. That's a very particular way of viewing the world, of being in the world.
Yeah.
And again, it harkens back to what we started the discussion with about the different kind of language you use to tell a story. This harkens back to the importance of words, the importance of language. Now, of course, Tolkien is a philologist. He's a word lover. His profession. He's not a novelist. He's not an author. He's not really just a writer. That's his side hobby. His day job is a university professor within the faculty of philology. So he's studying speech and stories and words and all this. So obviously it's important to him. And some people could write it off as simply, well, of course he is, because that's his profession. You know, if it were a plumber, he'd be writing different. But I think rather what we should take away from that is he's a specialist in this area. So he has a keener vision than the rest of us. He can show us more clearly, perhaps because that's his job as a teacher. He can show us more clearly the importance and the power of words, speech, and story, and song, for that matter.
Yeah, and I think he was very well aware of what you just said, the power of the words, and especially during his era of the 30s, when he was seeing the rise of these dictators who were using words as a way of manipulating other people, which is why I think emerged his whole philosophy of fantasy enchantment versus magic and the machine. I think it has a great deal of words. Great deal of
the the way that you use words is itself a magic spell, one could say. I mean, going back to, as we've mentioned, and many times in the past, the word spell is just the old Anglo-Saxon word for story.
And so you have
spell
to be very,
and story.
you have to be very careful, I think, because you have to recognize whether or not you're using it in a way that is, as Tolkien would suggest, magical, that is manipulating the world to advantage, or are you using words in a fantastical
enchantment? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very, I think he was very aware of just how much responsibility, with great power comes great responsibility, right? I think he was very aware of how much responsibility is on somebody who knows the difference in words, to use words appropriately, because you could crush a person's, you could change a person's life, really, I think, through words.
Oh, absolutely. I think all of us have had some moment in our life where, to a greater or lesser degree, there's a significant turning point because somebody said something or said something in a certain way.
Yeah. There's a great poem. I might not be able to find it, but I remember it from childhood, where the poet says, it's Carl Sandburg, I think. Yes, here it is. Carl Sandburg. And he wrote this. He said, "Look out how you use proud words. When you let proud words go, it is not easy to call them back. They wear long boots, hard boots. They walk off proud. They can't hear you calling. Look out how you use proud words." It's kind of a neat little take on it, that when you use words, sometimes you say them, especially when you say them proudly and rashly, like we will see later on with the Silmarils and the Oath. They take off. They go into the world like like Ursula Le Guin's demon, goes off into the world in the Wizard of Earth, and it goes off into the world and it wears long boots and hard boots and it walks off proud and it does damage in the world. And they can't hear you calling them back. They're like, "Oh, I didn't mean to say that. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to say that." And I mean, that's why I think that Tolkien was aware of how much governance one has to have on what you say, and also what you do, but what you say or show. And we live in a world where you can say anything goes. You can show anything, you can put anything on the screen, it's all okay. It's just whatever, just get over your hang-ups, man, and it's your problem, not mine. And so we're surrounded in a world of, I think, machine and magic, and of a violence that goes really rampant in our culture, especially American culture. And that kind of touches on the second thing that came up here when reading about the awakening of these elves under the stars. They awaken under the stars, a beautiful scene, and the natural and contemplative and all this. And they are, one could say, innocent, not childlike, but innocent when they start. Right. You project further on what's going to happen. Melkor ends up capturing several thousand of them, maybe more, and twisting them, perverting them, torturing them until he makes orcs. Right. And for all that I dislike the scene of the creation of orcs under Saruman in Jackson's version, he did get something in there, which is that the orc emerges from a sort of cocoon, if you will, right, an amniotic sac. And it's like a birth, but a kind of violent, horrible birth. And as far as imagery goes, it was a fairly good image, though, whatever. But what it did get,
out of Aliens, but yeah,
it's like, you're right. And by the way, that scene in Aliens is supposed to be a birth itself, so that's right, a violent birth too, because the whole movie of Alien is about abortion and about the residual effects of abortion, which that's a whole nother podcast to talk about. But
yeah,
E. Michael Jones, I think, really does a great job of analyzing that movie that way. But anyway, in the scene where the orc gets born, you get a sense of what Melkor does later to the children of Iluvatar is that he does a violence to them that is like a violent rebirth, but it's a rebirth into being twisted and horrible and enacting violence in the rest of the world. And that really brings up, I think, something that Tolkien was aware of, that when you start hearing bad words and seeing bad images and engaging in bad things, you end up becoming something twisted from what you should be. Our origins tell us what we ought to be. And what we ought to be is innocent children of song and stars and water, of dream, of beauty. what we might become if we aren't careful are these hardened, disgusting, horrible destroyers of the world. And I think at the very beginning, she's setting it up, because that's going to be kind of what we see even in the elves that are not twisted into orc further on down the road.
Yeah, that's true. And I think that's an issue, because that's, it's what we hear, what we surround ourselves, and the way that we, if what you do shapes who you are, right? That shapes your character, shapes the habits, right? You do certain things, they become habits. You allow yourself to speak in a certain way that's going to shape the kind of person that you become. It shapes the way that you begin to actually speak. And for that matter, the way you allow yourself to think, the way you choose to think, because often I think modern Western people, we tend to think that thoughts happen rather than they're active things that we do. But they're active things that we do. As a psychologist, that's just the truth. But we have a different story about that, right? That's part of the modern myth, is thoughts happen. This thought came to me, whatever. So there's a fine ways of talking, but we have to take greater ownership over our thoughts, because so much of our thoughts are influenced by, I mean, this is right, in shorthand, this is how propaganda works. Somebody else is making you think something, right, through subtle nudging and whatnot. And if you don't take ownership for your thoughts and be more awake, and neptic is the old Greek word for it, but be more awake and aware, choosing the thoughts that you have, that's a thing. And then the thoughts, the way that you choose to think and the way that you choose to speak, whether it's essentially words inside or words outside, then shapes the kind of person that you are. Like you said, the wrong words can really make you twisted, can really make you really twist yourself, become very twisted as a person. We see this in some cultures of language. Say Latin has this terminology. So a blessing is benediction, right? And a curse is a malediction. Really, what etymologically the words just mean, benediction is just right talking, right? Essentially, good words, speaking well, all together, not just like, oh, you're a well-spoken person, but it's the right kinds of words, good words. And a malediction is evil words, bad ways of thinking and speaking. And then that can be a curse. You can curse somebody by the words that you use, in the same way that you can bless somebody by the words that you use. And that's a concept that's just baked into the Latin language. And similar, analogies exist in other linguistic systems too. But that's just something that should make us think about that more.
Yeah,
be aware of that anyway.
Yeah, and along those lines, this is a question which may have a long time to answer. He has the elves waking up under these two constellations, right? Or well, the constellation.
They're born under a certain sign, essentially.
Sorry.
They're born under a certain sign, as it were.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm getting at. They're born under a certain sign. But what does that mean? That phrase, born under a bad sign, phrase harkens back to what we now call astrology, but really is a recognition that the stars were a language, that they in some ways they indicated the imprint of an idea on a person. And that when you're born under certain constellations, those constellations have influence over how you view the world and who you are as a person. They are words, in other words. The language of those stars is imprinted on the people that are born under them. And that's where we get astrology, and the whole idea of star-crossed lovers and sign baby and all that. That all comes from this idea of what is the imprint on you of the universal pattern depicted in the stars, which are emblematic of the logos. If we view that, you could say there's a fatedness, but if you view that as symbolic of our origins being towards something, it's very different than if you view it as the stars are just balls of gas and everything's kind of meaningless because I have run myself into a dead end where I see the world as nothing more than material, and I have no choice but to destroy it. In other words, it's very different than the orcish view, which is that the world is just this machine that I'm going to dominate over. And he's contrasting automatically this idea of enchantment and astrology and the logos with emptiness mechanized world and the destruction that ensues from it, I think. Even at the very beginning with those constellations. I'm not quite sure what to make of it. I think the question that comes up for me is there, if you're born under a good sign, good for you. If you get corrupted, can you be redeemed? And if you're born under a bad sign, is it all fate? And if you run into the bad sign that you're born under, is there redemption? Can you be redeemed? Does Tolkien even talk about redemption? Does he talk about being redeemed from these horrible situations that elves and men and hobbits get themselves into? That, I think, is a bigger question, perhaps, to answer at a future date.
Yeah,
but it's,
I think that's something that we would see. I think that's precisely what we see played out. And we'll have to look at that from time to time.
yeah,
In different situations that characters in the stories find themselves in.
Yeah. Beware proud words. Huh. It's an interesting thought.
Okay, especially when it comes to Fëanor, right?
Yeah.
Don't do it. Don't say it.
Don't go there. My gosh. Well, I think
we also
maybe
see the power of humble words, and we'll have to try and find those too.
Power of humble words. Huh, that's interesting. That's an interesting thought, the power of humble words. Yeah. And I'm sorry, I'm drawing this out a little bit more, but
that's it.
The power of humble words is one's response to the chaos and destruction and general misery of the world, that you throw your hands in the air and say, I'm going to be part of that misery and grind other things to dust, like Grendel. Or is one's response going to be, I'm going to create another beautiful thing in the world? Tolkien saw his share of misery and horror, and he chose not to become a grinder, so to speak. He didn't choose to become a part of that horrible movement that emerged after World War I, that eugenics movement, to fix the world through magic and science or machinery. He chose instead to become somebody who created beautiful things that have had long-lasting consequences. I think that's a choice. It's a very powerful and important choice that people are faced with. What do you do with the suffering you are bound to experience? Food for thought. I think that's a good place to cease on the midnight.
That's exactly right.
Thank you, Dr. Thompson.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Lassiter.
So, farewell wherever you fare. To your areas receive you at your journey's end.
And may the wind under your wings bear you where the sun sails and the moon walks.
Thank you.